All right, let's talk about Scrum. So, Scrum is a specific framework, methodology, other words I could use that probably aren't correct, thing in Agile. So it's under the Agile umbrella. I mentioned Agile is a larger term and there's stuff underneath it, and Scrum is one of them. And this is the way it works. And essentially what they've done is they've kind of formalized the process of like, if we look back at the Agile Manifesto, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, responding to change over following a plan. Like all of these things embody what is happening in this Scrum workflow. So first, it all starts with the product backlog. The product backlog is the list of all of the things the customer could ever think to want, at least right now. So these are things that may not make it into the software for like a year or so, but it's basically everything. So prior to having the product backlog, there were very large meetings where the Scrum team, the actual customer got into a room and really talked about what software needed to be built. And things got defined at a higher level, typically as user stories. And so this product backlog could have hundreds and hundreds of user stories, but it's basically just everything that could be built in this piece of software. And it's important to note that it's also prioritized. So while there is this huge list of all the things that need to be built, the things that are at the top are the highest priority in terms of what brings the most business value. And then from a development perspective, like what needs to be in place in terms of architecture and design before other things can be put into place. And so things are prioritized. You have this big long list, and then you go into the sprint planning meeting. In the sprint planning meeting, you're planning your next sprint. So sprints can vary by team. It could be 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. Sprint really says your sprints, or sorry, Scrum really says that your sprints should be no longer than 4 weeks, no longer than a month, because the longer they get, the longer you're going without feedback and without information about what you've done and validation about what you've done from the customer. So your iterations are typically under 4 weeks. All of the teams I've been on have pretty much done 2-week iterations, but it varies. If you're on a team and they have 6-month iterations, then they are not agile. They're calling themselves agile, but they are not agile. I will just say that right now. Okay. So, but leading into this sprint, you have the sprint planning meeting, and your focus is, okay, going into this, what are we going to build? And typically you take the highest priority things out of the backlog and say, okay, these 5 stories, this is what we're going to build in this iteration. Now, that's a very informal way of saying it, but typically if you're on a team that has done several iterations, after each iteration, you get a much better idea of what your team can actually accomplish. So going into the sprint planning meeting, you can say, well, we know last sprint, we have the last sprint with the same team that we have now, we were able to complete 20 story points. So we can reliably say that going into this sprint, we can choose stories that add up to about 20 story points. Story points is another concept that I haven't really touched on, but it's a way of sizing stories, not in terms of hours, but in terms of relative complexity. So you have these size stories, you go into the planning meeting and say, okay, we're going to do this stuff for this specific sprint. You also talk about like, what is your goal for the sprint? And it's typically something that's like end user focused. So by the end of the sprint, we want users to be able to list all of the items in their shopping cart. Like that's the goal for the sprint, and all of the work is going to be leading towards that goal. Great. You then have the sprint backlog. So the sprint backlog is a much smaller list, but it's a list of things that are going to be done in that sprint. And then you have your iterations. So on a daily basis, you have your daily scrum, which is basically a 10-minute meeting. And it's not exactly a status report. So this is where some misconceptions in Scrum can come into play, where developers say like, oh, a meeting every single day. No, this is like, you just got your coffee, you're all standing in a circle, and everyone is on the same page about where the project is and who's going to be working on what. So typically you answer 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? And do you have any blockers? So part of this stand-up is to get that quick update from everyone on the team in like less than 10 minutes. And typically the person in charge of making sure it only lasts 10 minutes is the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master makes sure things are flowing, and then after those 10 minutes, we can talk more in detail about blockers. So that's basically, okay, I'm working on the front end today, but I really need this API to exist, and so I'm kind of waiting on the backend team to get that done, and I can't move forward until that gets done. That would be one of my updates for blockers, and then the Scrum Master knows, okay, I need to make sure I get you in contact with this person. We're going to work out all those blocks. But that happens after the Scrum. So the Scrum is quick updates. Scrum Master makes note of any blockers. Anyone that didn't have any blockers or that isn't involved in that can go off and do their work for the day. And anyone that did have blockers, we're going to try to unblock them and get them connected with the people they want to get connected with. So that happens on a daily basis. You're also actually building things and all that good stuff. And then at the end of the sprint, however long it is, you have a potentially releasable increment or a potentially usable piece of software, meaning all the features in the sprint backlog got implemented. We now have something we're ready to show the customer, and most likely there are features in this that the customer can use and benefit from and start to give us feedback on. You have a meeting that is a sprint review, so you just talk about what did we get done in the sprint, and then you also have a retrospective where you are more self-critical. So typically in the retrospectives I've been a part of, we ask 3 questions. What should we start doing? What should we stop doing? And what should we continue doing? So as a team, you're very self-critical in terms of like how you worked together, how the planning meeting went going into this sprint, how effective were we in removing blockers. You just try to be really, really self-critical so that going into the next sprint, you're a better team. And typically coming out of the retrospective, you have action items. You say, okay, last sprint, we weren't as effective in communicating blockers. So a goal for this sprint is we're going to try to be much more effective in communicating those things. So really, it's just a feedback cycle. Then it just goes back to the beginning. You had your retrospective, then you go back and you plan your next sprint meeting. One thing that also happens is product backlog refinement. So because requirements might be changing or what the customer requires might change, this big backlog of stories gets shuffled around. Like, we say, okay, in the last sprint, we implemented these things, but we actually realized that this other feature would be a higher priority, so we're going to move that up in the backlog. And so that's happening in the background so that going into the next sprint planning meeting, you're still on the same page about what should be developed going into the sprint planning meeting. Cool. That's this cycle, this flow. There are some variations on it. You'll see some other images out there. I do like this more like simplified one. You've got your product backlog. That's everything that will or could ever be developed. Your sprint backlog, that's just what you're going to be writing in this sprint. You then have your iteration, which is 30 days or less. And then on a 24-hour basis, you have stand-up or your Scrum meeting. And at the end of it all, you have a working increment of software. That is the Scrum process. I think one last thing I want to mention on Scrum is roles. Because in Scrum, these are like very specific. In Scrum, you typically have the product owner. And the product owner is essentially the customer representative. Here it says they are the voice of the customer. So this is typically someone that's at your company and on your team, but they are kind of the liaison and they represent the customer's best interests. So as a developer, you should be able to talk to the product owner and have a question about, well, what does the customer want? I have this specific requirement, but there are a couple of ways I could go about it. I could go to the product owner and ask them, and I would hope that they would give me an answer that is on behalf of the customer. Now, that doesn't replace talking to the customer directly, but it does help having someone on your team that is closer to the customer than maybe your development team is. So that's the product owner. This is different than a project manager. Like, a lot of people confuse product owner, project manager. You could have a product owner that is the project manager, though there could be some conflicts of interest there. I think one of the main things and one of the main reasons they have this role in Scrum is that you need someone who is a customer representative. It isn't someone who's just going to be focusing on development or focusing on other things. They are focusing on and representing the customer, the person we are building this piece of software for. Okay, the other thing is the development team. So these are all the people that are working on the software. A lot of times you might have full stack developers, but I've worked on teams where we have like 2 front end developers, 2 back end developers, 1 QA person. QA is quality assurance. And so basically you have your team, and these are the people that are actually writing the software. And it's typically a small team. So this here says 3 to 9 members. You don't want a really big team. You want a team that can effectively communicate and work together. And it really is the larger the team, the more lines of communication there are, meaning the longer things take, the longer it takes to onboard people or communicate people or find the person you need that knows something that you need to know. So we try to keep these teams pretty small. And you typically see that it's self-organizing or cross-functional, whereas you might have like team leads or like a technical lead, but at the end of the day, everyone knows what their role is and they're doing everything they can to get that done. They're not being like micromanaged or anything like that. And then you also have the Scrum Master. So this is the person that makes sure everything is going smoothly in stand-up. They make sure that stand-up only lasts 10 minutes. They make sure to get people unblocked. And they're basically just facilitating the team and making sure that it's running as like a nice, well-oiled machine. The Scrum Master, in my experience, could actually be someone from the development team. So I've done it in the past where, let's take a quick stretch. I've been talking a lot. I've done it in the past where the Scrum Master actually rotates on the team. So after every iteration, you assign someone new to be the Scrum Master, and now it's their role to make sure that the team works as a cohesive unit. So these are typically the roles that you see in Scrum. That is Scrum in a nutshell. Thanks for watching.